Hello and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. My name is Drew. I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Alex.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
Hello. This week we are going to be talking about the recently unveiled Middle East peace plan that Trump announced, the official plan on January 28th of this year, 2020. And it was promptly rejected by the Palestinians, which is, one half of the deal. And we're going to be discussing a little bit about why was it rejected? What did the plan kind of look like, and perhaps maybe a little bit of historical insight as to how this differs or is similar to previous attempts at a solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict in the Middle East that has been going on for very long. Alex, first off, how you doing, man? And what are your initial thoughts on this Middle East peace plan?
Hey, Drew, I'm doing pretty well. The weather has been warm in Madrid. The contamination, or I guess pollution, has been getting worse. I have allergies, but it's not allergy season. So I think it's just this dry, contaminated air. So that's probably not good, but that's a whole other issue. But talking about this peace plan to begin, my first takeaway is that since 1919, when there were the first talks of an Israeli state under British rule, until now, it seems like there's always been one common trend in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that Palestine has never really had a seat at the decision-making table. They've really never been able to have the same sway and political tout and just money that is lobbied into these decisions. And it has always seemed to me like it's the United States, Israel, and Arabic powers like Egypt and Saudi Arabia that are brokering deals that benefit them and do not help Palestine. And this deal is about the same. This plan, like you said, which came out on the 28th, according to Foreign Policy magazine, its proposition is to let Israel's separation wall, which is built as a temporary precaution, be its eastern border, letting the Palestinian Authority take responsibility for areas east and north. Basically, Basically, this designation only applies to the city of Jerusalem proper, which will stay in Israel. And then that means there's going to be all these other separations that go back to earlier times, but it's going to be super divisive. So I think it's going to be quite grim, mainly because the Palestinian capital outlined in this would be Abu Dis or Shuafat. And please excuse me for my pronunciation in advance. But both of these sit on the other side of a hulking concrete separation barrier. So then Palestine would only retain about 75% of the West Bank, which would be divided into 3 cantons linked by highways, and a tunnel would connect it to Gaza, and there'd be 2 remote plots of land in the western Negev desert. But basically, what in general this plan seems is it's going to allow the hawkish Benjamin Netanyahu regime in Israel to kind of keep doing their thing, and Palestine's going to get a little percentage of what they want, but it's really good for Israel.
Yeah. There's a couple things that just immediately strike me as so strange and unconventional, and one of which is the fact that, yes, the land that the Trump plan proposes is not congruent. It doesn't meet, like, you have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are separated from the eastern side, right, towards the whole areas of like Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and they suggest to have a tunnel that goes across like 20 something miles to connect that, and that would be technically Palestinian. And then again, I'll put up the map on the YouTube. So for those that want to look along the map with me right now, you'll be able to do that on the YouTube. On YouTube. But and then also on the west side, there's like, again, the highways connect these little strips that go down to a high-tech manufacturing industrial area and a residential and agricultural area. And it just looks so strange. It reminds me of like gerrymandered districts in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
where and it just seems that like just off the bat, it seems like there's no way that this can be a normal and sustainable way to like draw the borders of a nation, of a supposedly independent sovereign nation. So that alone just struck me as the first thing immediately. I'd be like, of course this is rejected. This looks ridiculous. A 25-mile tunnel to get to the other side of the country? That's crazy. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think this is what you get from, I would say, 4 to 5 decades of strong Israeli lobbying,
Right.
and really not much of a lobby or a say on the other side. I completely, support an Israeli state, and I support the protection of the Jewish people. I think it's important because we've seen some of the atrocities that have come out of the 20th century to a people that are powerful and intelligent but didn't have a state and became the brunt of a lot of nationalism and racism and fascism. But at the same time, I think what we're almost starting to see inside of Israel and Palestine is somewhat of a quasi-apartheid state, because there's a lot of Palestinians that live inside of Israel, and there are a lot of Israelis that are inside that kind of gray area, and it's extremely complicated. And I'm just worried that this new deal is just more of the same. But the more sinister side of it is that for the first time ever, they're actually trying to just say, okay, well, we'll give you this and we'll help Israel maintain this, but it's not equal. And you're right. A giant tunnel that connects one country so they don't cross into this new land that's been given to Israel just isn't right, and this is kind of worrying to me because Benjamin Netanyahu right now does not have a majority support inside of his own government because of very, very believable corruption charges. And I think that for him, this is a political victory. And in the past, it used to be the United States working with Israel and kind of being the lawyer to the Israeli-Palestine issue or the broker. But now it kind of seems like we just become Benjamin Netanyahu's lawyer.
Mm.
And I find this worrying because the Washington Post says there's this man, Youssef Jabarin, had heard only politicians on Israelis' ideological fringe suggest that he and thousands of these are Arab Israelis could be stripped of their Israeli citizenship. And because, like I was saying, about 20% of Israel's population are Arabic people and Palestinians, but many of these people may not get citizenship under this new law. And there's a single paragraph in Trump's 181-page document that proposes the potential redrawing of Israel's borders, such as that a cluster of 10 Arab towns north of Tel Aviv, known as the Triangle, would be subsumed by a future Palestinian state. So these are people that have grown up in Israel, and now all of a sudden may be told, no, you're actually Palestinian now. And that's a huge issue for people that their whole lives may be Muslim and maybe from Arab descent, but they are as Israeli as anyone else in this country, because the country is not based on ethnicity. It's based on a common framework and a common law.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that would be incredibly upsetting if you just suddenly woke up one day and you're like, hey, by the way, you're a citizen of a different state. Oh, and by the way, the state that you are now a citizen of is noticeably behind in education and structure and infrastructure and in institutions. That would be incredibly upsetting. That's another thing too, right, is, Palestine, like Israel's economy is miles ahead of Palestine's economy. And having these changes would be pretty shocking, I think, to the economy, as well as, I don't know, again the other thing too is like, what's the long term, right? So yeah, like, because the Trump White House has said, look, we're allowing them to have a high tech manufacturing industrial area, we're allowing them to have access, all this stuff, and it's like, yeah, but things grow and change over time. And it's not always going to be the same. Like, if they want their economy to continuously grow, they might have to expand. And that's also Israel's argument for their settlements. Now, here's an interesting part is just for those that don't know, there's been a lot of contention over Israeli settlements in areas that Palestinians claim are Palestine, that Israelis claim are Israel, that the UN has constantly been trying to reprimand Israel for these settlements. It's been a big source of contention, and it's led to like violence with Hamas. So Trump's plan offers a 4-year settlement freeze, and that Israel would freeze settlement construction for 4 years, and increase the amount of territory under direct Palestinian control. That sounds good, but to me, it also sounds like it's kicking the can down the river or down the road, right? Like, okay, a 4-year settlement freeze is good for 4 years, but then what happens after that? Israel starts making settlements again. Palestinians get upset and start reacting again, and the cycle continues. So, I mean, we see this time and time again of ceasefires that don't even last their amount of time that they're supposed to before more missiles are shot. And
Yeah.
it seems like if you wanted to have Palestine even remotely near the table of this discussion, you would have to completely reject and ban any more Israeli settlements. Not 4 years freeze, but a complete and utter rejection of more Israeli settlements. I don't see how you can do anything without that happening. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I completely know what you mean, and it's it's true. I mean, I think if you could have one phrase to sum up this whole last, I guess, a century of issues, is kicking the can down the road. That has pretty much been from day one, since the British rule and the Balfour Agreement in, I think, 1919 or something. That's pretty much been how this has gone. And it's just worrying to me, because I want to go back to what you said about the difference in economies, and I think that's a really interesting point. Because earlier I talked about this cluster of 10 Arab towns that would be then transferred to this new future Palestinian state, if it would ever exist. And this group of 10 towns is known as the Triangle. And when I talk about the Triangle, according to the UN partition plan that created Israel, this was back in 1948, the Triangle communities were meant to fall under Jordanian control. But after the war, they were retained by Israel. And so this is a historic group that has always been almost economically part of Israel, though there are obviously different ethnic groups there. And so Deanna Boutou, who's a former legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team, said the issue of transferring the Arab population of the Triangle area had not been raised in previous negotiations. And she said if we allow states to choose which people have been in them based on race or ethnicity, it's not only going to bring down their economics, but it's also going to lead to a state of apartheid. So I just wanted to just say that, but also what you were saying too is that kicking the can down the road, like the New York Times has already reported that there has been mass violence growing just since this peace plan. And so, I mean, yeah, you're right. 4 years stalling the growth of these communities is not enough. And you can clearly see the Palestinians obviously are seeing through the BS in this, because at least 3 Palestinians were killed during clashes with Israeli security forces in the West Bank on Wednesday and Thursday. And then an Israeli soldier was seriously wounded in a car ramming in Jerusalem overnight. So clearly the Palestinians don't like this because, like you said, it's kicking the can down the road. The economic situation is dire and split. And, I mean, that's the big issue, is that if you really want peace, quote unquote peace, or some sort of two-state solution, you're going to need to convince the Palestinian people, first off, and that's going to be really tough, especially when you have one of the most right-wing governments ever in Israel right now that clearly doesn't care about that.
I think that's the fundamental thing, right? Like, even if you had a well-intentioned and honest, Trump administration trying to have a two-state solution, it's the fact that our relationship with Israel is like we give so much economic and military support to Israel, and Israel's currently in a very right-wing government, right? Pro-Israel nationalist government, and that we're supporting that. I think that alone already just blocks any chance of the Palestinians even coming to the table. And you could argue, right, that the Palestinians should at least hear us out and come to the table. That's a valid argument. But I think the political reality is, because of how pro-Israel the United States is, the Palestinians will not see us as a non-biased, mutual what's it called? Arbitrator.
Arbitrator, yeah.
There's no way. There's no way they're going to see us as an arbitrator when we're giving the Israelis hundreds of millions of dollars and fighter jets, and then the Israelis are using it. Like I don't. So like, even if you had a well-intentioned Trump administration, it's just not a possibility in the current political climate. You would have to have someone who is more outspokenly not anti-Israel, but not as like pro-Netanyahu and blindly pro-Israel in the White House to even get to the table with the Palestinians. To me, it seems like the Trump administration put this out to look to kind of look like, hey, we're doing a good job. Jared Kushner also went around and was trying to get all buddy with Arab states to do this. I think there might be some ulterior motives for that, right? To kind of like improve our standing with Israel, but as also improve our standing with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So it's just very interesting, but it just seems like it's so dead on arrival that it's almost disingenuous.
Yeah, it's sadly true. And I think that like what you're mentioning there between just the political gridlock and the lobbying from this nationalist linked to a party to, you have AIPAC in the United States, and you obviously have a very pro-Israel nationalist government right now in the United States with Trump. And there's really nothing completely new. Obama was a little more open, but at the end of the day, I don't think in the last 4 or 5 presidents we've really had any break from this.
No.
And I think the bigger issue is something we've talked about before on this is I think the elephant in the room is that the Middle East is unstable. Palestine doesn't particularly have many allies in the region.
No.
The Saudis are completely fine with buying, the Israelis are completely fine with buying oil from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia does not care that this is a giant divide between Jews and Muslims, and that's the issue, is that, as we've seen, is that I feel extremely bad for the Palestinians who have kind of always got the short end of the stick here. But there has been no political or social mobilization inside of their country that is different from terrorism. And obviously that's a whole other discussion where when you lack, political power, you resort to brute force. But what's his name? Mohammed Abbas, who's the current president of Palestine, he was supposed to serve for 4 years, and he's been there for 16.
Right.
And we've also had just mass violence. And I do think that there's a bit of martyrdom that comes from these, Israeli soldiers killed a Palestinian family and whatnot. And I think it's become so ugly that there is a lot that Palestine needs to answer for as well, and that's what makes it even harder, is that, like you said, is that Palestine does need to eventually come to the table. And I think that they've been so short-sighted so many times, and they've resorted to such violence, these intifada's and stuff, that I almost think that it's going to be extremely hard to really get them unless there's social change in both countries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's not. It does. It's what's the old saying? Like, you can bring a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink.
Yeah.
Like, you still have to like. I don't think we've even tried to bring the Palestinian horse to the water. But even if you did, it still takes the Palestinian people themselves to want to see a peaceful 2-state solution. And historically, we've seen violence. Now, the discussion of whether it's justified is a whole different thing, because we're so deep into the cycle of violence that it's hard to find, it's hard to pinpoint where it's justified and where it's not, because you can get so deep into the weeds on the cycle of violence in Palestine and Israel. But that's the problem, right? Is for our perspective, it's a lot easier to be like, just come to the table. We could start to talk this out. It might not be a perfect plan, but at least you can be there to have your say. But I have to imagine that if I was in the position of someone in Palestine that had seen the violence and seen the oppression for so long, I would be way less willing to go to the table, even if that is probably the best next step. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have this armchair perspective, and that's all we have. I'm not faulting us for it because we're not there, but I think that they don't have an armchair perspective, and the Israeli side as well. If you're an Israeli citizen who has your house been blown up by Hamas missiles, I also imagine it's harder to have that armchair perspective. That's why it's such a complicated. And again, this, but that's why it's such a complicated issue, because so much of the world does want to see a peaceful two-state solution, but the people that are involved have been so rooted in violence for so long. It's going to be incredibly difficult to break out of that. And what your point about the is Palestinian president being there for 16 years, it does show that people can kind of, when you're so distraught, you can get kind of complacent with strong leaders, when in reality you need to start building up a functioning society, and in my view a democratic one. But it looks like that's not going to happen.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's very true, and I think you touched on it well, is that I think complacency is the issue. And when you have such entrenched violence that has literally gone back since the end of World War I, it is hard, especially when Western powers and even your Gulf allies, quote allies, because clearly they were not, when no one's really let you have a seat at the table, I think it is very difficult to reach anything. And we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but I really think the big issue, and Trump's plan follows this same scheme, is that we're throwing money at the problem, but the money seems to just be going into a dumpster fire that's just burning it all away.
Yes.
Because so I got some of these quotes from Al Jazeera, so you can take it as you want, but I think their general point is true. And the article is called "Trump's Middle East Plan May Have a Silver Lining." And basically they say Trump's plan will not make the Palestinians' lives better, but it could help dismantle the disastrous Oslo Order. And basically the point is that despite the tens of millions of dollars that have poured into these territories since 1993, like you have said, the disparity between Palestine and Israel in the economic sector is drastic. And basically this started in the Oslo process in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, when they were inspired by the idea of peace dividends. And this was basically throwing money into the problem, promising a new era of prosperity where Gaza would be transformed into something of a Singapore of the Middle East.
Yeah, that has not happened. Huh?
No. And then this was followed by the roadmap for peace put forward by Bush in 2003, which also positioned their stance as economic growth to lead to the peace process. And then Obama in 2013's peace plan offered the Palestinians $4 billion to boost their economy. And then once again, Trump's one has actually again mentioned turning Palestine into the Singapore of the Middle East. And I think the elephant in the room is that they don't need money. They need a grassroots movement that can change the system. And I just don't know if that is possible right now, because back at Chapman, I remember I took I think it was a conflict of the Middle East class, something along those lines. I'm not going to use professors' names, but the professor had always talked to us and taught us that a two-state solution is almost impossible. It's probably never going to happen. The realistic point is something of a one-state solution, where both countries, it's somewhat, kind of a North and South Korea, which we hope will happen eventually idea.
Right.
Because it's just, I don't know if these two sides could ever particularly agree on splitting up the land. And we're seeing that even with this Trump plan. When you were looking at the map, it just said this looks insane.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. Is like a one-state solution where you have political representation, maybe in the form of parties or whatever. Not that that's perfect. We obviously see how divisive that can be in our own country. But that would certainly be preferable to two states that are always a proxy war. That's basically what we have currently, right? There's countries in the world that don't recognize Israel as a real state, and there's countries in the world that don't recognize Palestine as a real state. And we have such a morass of illegitimacy. I think you're absolutely right that the fact that previously we think that, if we just boost their economy, then the rest will follow suit. But I don't think that works when you have when it's so deeply rooted in one land, right? The physical land, right? Because we have the Jordan Valley, you have the Gaza Strip, the West Bank. These are physical parts of the world that people fight over. So
Hmm.
you have to address the physical land aspect. You can't just, oh well, if your economy's good, then you can get rid of that Jordan Valley that you've been fighting over for generations. I don't see that happening. Also, on top of that is the religious and cultural conflict, right? You know, let's not forget that a lot of this does stem from Judaism versus Islam in this context, and you can't just like throw money to get rid of religious wars. Um, I think that again, with my limited knowledge, I think that you are correct that it's going to have to be a form of political representation and political justice, and not just an economic boost that's going to satiate the violence.
Uh-huh. No, I think that's extremely well said. And the problem, I think, to get this representative state, obviously there's flaws. And as you saw from this already, as you called it, gerrymandered map that they tried to create, there's not going to be equality, even in a one-state solution.
Right.
But I think there's a better reason for discourse and discussion. But the problem is, I don't think this linked to a party led by Benjamin Netanyahu right now can do it. And I mean, most stats show right now that he might not survive. There's a lot of corruption charges that are out against him, and he's not doing well with public opinion. He does not have a majority in their parliament.
Right.
And so I almost think that he needs to go. I think that they need a more moderate party, whether that's left or right. I don't really care, but they don't need this nationalist linked to a party. And I think the other side of that is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, has had a flawed view of the U.S.'s role. The U.S. is not a mediator. Like I said earlier, it shouldn't be thought of as the broker. They have to realize that AIPAC and Israel have been able to sway politicians back home through grassroots politics and money. And well, let's be completely honest. I think what needs to happen inside of the Palestinian society is less violence and maybe more of a grassroots movement, like I keep saying, to start trying to realize that the way to get into American minds and legislators' minds in the United States is through a group that could maybe be the equivalent of the Zionist movement. And I don't think Palestine has that, because a lot of Americans, I think if you're just going to say, oh, those are terrorists, that's Hamas, that's groups that are funded by, Lebanese, terrorist groups and whatnot. And
Right.
They need to change.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Now, I have seen I've never been to Israel or Palestine, but I have seen in documentaries and stuff that there are people that want peace. There are people that don't hate, there are Israelis that don't hate Palestinians and vice versa. They exist, but they don't, they are not the ones in political power. And I think it would take like a unified movement to do that. Yeah, it's really tough, man. Again, for those listening, I don't want to pretend like I have the answer to this, because I definitely don't. But I really don't. But I do know that whatever this Trump proposal is definitely not going to work. I mean, it's already dead on arrival. The Palestinians weren't at the table. They don't want anything to do with it. But even if let's say, even if a miracle happened and it was enacted, I don't think this plan would even last that long. It just doesn't seem like it has any sustainability whatsoever. Like if you're, what I mean, if you're to like simulate it out, I don't think it would work.
No.
As to what would work, that's who knows.
Well, I mean, I think we both came away with one agreement on this, and I think it's abstract, but it is probably a change in which people should be starting to look at more. Is stop throwing money at the problem.
Yes.
Stop trying to divide up the country.
Yes.
Maybe try to find a way to get equal representation among groups.
Right.
It's happened before. It can happen again. You can
have like a one-state solution that has different provinces, and the provinces have representatives, right? Like something like that. You would still have, division, but perhaps if you put people under one umbrella, they are less likely to, go to civil war and have violence if you all identify under the same flag, same nation, and everything, right? But we'll see. That's kind of a pipe dream.
And yeah, there's a lovely quote from the book *Sapiens*. Noah Harari, is actually Israeli. I didn't even think that was, I forgot about that, but Israeli historian, genius. He has a good point. This has nothing to do with Israel, but I think it relates to this, where you mentioned, and I've seen this too in documentaries. I think I even saw this in Anthony Bourdain back in the day, where when he went to Israel and went to Palestine, most of the people don't give a crap about, all these specifics. They just, they enjoy the culture and they enjoy each other. And so what Harari said in the book, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm not going to say quotes, but he says that history is what's made while most people are carrying water and growing plants.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. I think most people don't really care about all this BS that's happening. People just want to live and get along. And it's unfortunately the higher ups in both Palestinian provinces and in the linked party that don't want that to happen for personal gains. But the problem is, I do think with the Trump administration, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem was freaking stupid. Yes. That's a tri-religious city, man. That is a city that the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews all call, as their Mecca, basically. I mean, I'm not gonna say it's Mecca because there is a Mecca,
right.
But you know what I mean. And so to say it's only the Jewish city is sacrilegious.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that brings me back to that original point, that just the fact that it is Trump bringing this plan, that's why it's dead on the water, is because Trump has done stuff like that, where it's like there was no logistical reason to move the embassy. There was no, as far as I know, there was no like national security issue to move it. It was simply a symbolic gesture of we're pro-Israel. And that alone is going to tell the Palestinians, okay, whatever plan you think you have is obviously going to be tinted pro-Israel, so why would we even come to the table? And so I think that kind of sums up what just happened, pretty simply.
Yeah, no, that's extremely right. Like, the rest is moot, honestly.
Yeah. Well, with that, that'll conclude today's joyous, uplifting, and positive episode of the Tonic Accord. Please let us know what you think. Obviously, this is a highly contentious topic. We'd love to hear your opinion, no matter what it is. Do you think that a two-state solution would even be possible in the near future? Do you think that Trump's plan is a good one or a bad one, and why? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you, and we always enjoy